Good morning, everybody. My name is Connor Flanagan. I'm the Director of Education here at the Southampton History Museum. And today we are joined by author Skip Finley. I'm going to turn it over to him pretty much right away so we can get started. Please sign up for any of our future programs, southamptonhistory.org. You can see all of our previous lectures here on our YouTube page. And we have a lot of great blogs on our website, southamptonhistory.org/blog, which this video will also be hosted on so we can get it out to as many people as possible. So without any further ado, I'm going to pass it over to Skip and enjoy, everybody.
All right. Thank you, Connor. I do appreciate that. Thank you all for joining us this morning. It's wonderful. What I'd like to do today is to tell you a little bit about my curiosity and the two most asked questions that I get about this book is how did Black guys become whaling captains and how did I find them? The story of whaling is not just the Moby Dick that we all were supposed to have read, back in school, and of course none of us did. A wondrous book though it was. But the story of whaling probably should be better known because it was a business enterprise that took place for about 280 years. Over the course of that time, about 175,000 people went whaling. Between 50 to 70,000 of them turned out to be men of color. By that, men of color, I mean free Black men, former slaves, West Indians, American Indians, Cape Verdeans, Kanakas, Maori, Portuguese, and South Sea Islanders. These are people who had skin that was black, brown, yellow, or any range of tan that included colored, copper, mixed, mulatto, or mustee, a peculiar term used for the product of relationships between Black and Native American partners. Yes, we're going to speak a little bit about Native Americans. You guys have, two very famous captains, the Lee brothers, we're going to talk about, a little bit. Over the years, since May 1796, you'll recall we had been at war with a country called Britain in the 1770s. They had the nasty habit of impressing our sailors, not that our fleet was that large, but, that was very harmful when, they had the most magisterial fleet of any country in the world at the time. They would impress our sailors. So our country adopted a practice of having whalers in particular, seamen generally, fill out these seamen protection papers. And what that did was function pretty much like your passport. So when the British came upon your whale ship, you'd be able to say, okay, I'm an American citizen and you just can't, willy-nilly take me and have me do whatever, whatever you want. A very good thing about this Seamen's Protection Papers is over the years, they developed into a thing that now we call kind of casually the crew list, which is a database that during the Workers' Progress Administration in the real depression back in the 30s, in order to put people to work doing things, they employed artists to take all this information, the Seamen's Protection Papers, and put them on index cards, which, by the way, physically reside at the New Bedford Free Public Library. For those of you still familiar with libraries and card catalogs, there are 133 card catalog drawers filled with the names of these sailors, these mariners, and it tells a little bit about them. Where they were from, how tall they were, what they looked like generally. By what they looked like, they describe men of color as Negro, mulatto, Indian, Black, brown, dark yellow, or copper, which pretty much could just mean men with tans. So you had to differentiate, between the two of those. Well, of course, in my studies, I spent quite a bit of time. I've been to the Southampton Museum, by the way. Most of my time is spent at the New Bedford Whaling Museum, the Nantucket Historical Association, the Provincetown, Library, and the Provincetown Whaling Museum, as well. But it was the crew list, a list of about 120-some thousand names, about 20 or so columns long, that someone like me is able to data sort on a spreadsheet, so that all the ones that were Black would rise to the top, all the ones that were captains would rise to the top. And I could do further research when I found these people's names. Over at the New Bedford Whaling Museum, again, to talk a little bit about whaling, they had this huge amount. I've got a small version of what I bought. You're not going to be able to see it on the screen. But I absolutely love this. I'm going to show you a couple of things on it in particular. If you can see the tiny red and yellow, red and blue dots, that's every place in the world where whales were captured. They're uncountable. And the legend on this map says, in the 1800s, thousands of voyages with tens of thousands of men hunted hundreds of thousands of whales by traveling billions of miles for tens of millions of gallons of oil for hundreds of millions in profits. In fact, in my research, which is arguable because it's, the records as they were kept, the information as it is presented, doesn't allow you a straightforward, but a guesstimate is from roughly the early 1700s till 1928, the whaling community killed about 300,000 whales, worth in today's money about $10 billion. So you can see it was a proper enterprise. A part of the enterprise, again, that often goes ignored is over those years, the majority of them, whaling was the 5th largest industry in America and the 3rd largest in the state of Massachusetts, which accounted for probably close to 90% of all of the whaling of the country. The first black whaling captain, man of color, it's, I can describe him as black, and I'm going to explain that, a little bit further as we go on. But in 1778, Paul Cuffey was the first black whaling captain. He actually owned his own ships. He was captain of his own ship. That was the first year that he was captain. But in 1778 was the same year that the state of Massachusetts decided an article in its constitution that every man in the state could vote unless you were black or Negroes, Indians, or mulattoes. Captain Cuffey, of course, was all three. Born in 1759 to parents who were one, a Native American woman, a Wampanoag, and a father who was a former slave. He was released from slavery by his owner, from Africa. So he was all three of these people. He was black, he was Native American, he was that peculiar term we mentioned before, called the mustee, product of Native American, and the black person. Interestingly enough, 1775 was the same year that we finally established our Navy in this country. So putting all of this into perspective, what goes unnoticed is for fundamentally the entire period of whaling as an industry, Black people in America were slaves. Now, I take it up until 1928 because if you add the post-Civil War Reconstruction period, or as I paraphrase and I like to say, that was a time when the South decided that having lost the war, they would prove they won the argument by saying the war wasn't about slavery. Of course, today we know it was. The business of whaling is very interesting from a lot of perspectives. I'll share with you a modern one, but the business itself is characterized was 15,913 whale trips. Each of these trips averaged 3 to 4 years. 2,700 trips were used to pursue this business, which is tantamount to find the whale, kill it, cut it up, melt it down into oil, fill the hull with this oil, and return home to make money from it. A lot of people don't realize the model that was used. Each of these 15,913 trips was a separate business enterprise, familiar to many of you as today's modern venture capital companies, a hedge fund or a private equity company. Different investors, owners would finance, putting a ship on the water, which costs somewhere between $50,000 and $60,000. Let's say $50,000 in today's terms. That's what it costs. Buy the boat, build the boat, outfit it, provision it, send the crew out, to pursue its business. Once the ship returned home, the first money, that initial $50,000 and whatever else, was returned to the investors. After that, the captain or the management and the crew would share the rest of these proceeds. So captain may get, 1/10 to 1/15 of the proceeds after the cost of the ship. The lowest person on totem pole, the green hen in the latter days of whaling, might only get 1/200th of those proceeds. So you can see over the years, a lot of people didn't get paid or actually lost money on whale trips. I was asked in a recent presentation, Now that you mentioned, hedge funds and private equity firms, what were the returns of whaling? As best we've been able to determine, whaling produced what's called an internal rate of return of about 15 to 25%. Surprisingly, that's a similar return that hedge funds and private equity firms, do today. Yes, some do dramatically more, some do substantially less, but that's a pretty good number, a useful, one that we can use in discussing the business of whaling. Also forgotten in that romance about Moby Dick and Captain Ahab was how dangerous this business was, or it was more dangerous than any other occupation in America except mining. Along the way, that wasn't the worst, because after that, whaling included boredom, cannibalism, inadequate clothing, desertion, disease, poor food, odors from hell, bad and inexperienced management, barbaric medical care, mutiny, parsimonious owners, poor pay, piracy, cramped quarters, vermin infestation, frightening weather, and at times, whales that fought back. Now, that actually didn't happen quite as many times as we've been led to believe, because again, our framework is that great story, that wonderful literature of Moby Dick. When the white whale finally kills Captain Ahab. Well, I've been able to find only 47 times when a captain was killed by a whale. To put that in context, we have had 2,500 whaling captains, 50 of whom happen to have been, men of color, as we're talking about today. English author Samuel Johnson wrote, "A ship is worse than a jail. There isn't a jail, better air, better company, better convenience of every kind. For over 60% of the time whaling was an industry, Black people were legally enslaved and people of color, of course, marginalized. In fact, over this entire period of time, the overwhelming majority of these 175,000 men that went whaling only went once. It didn't take long on a whale ship, probably as long as 2 days, before the first thing you want to do was to get off of that ship. Over its history, we now are able to determine, thanks to logs and thanks to information that's been recorded, on scene protection, certificates, and other information over the years, what we find that maybe 90% of these people only went on one whale trip. So that in a way is creating opportunity when you're working in a business that 30 to 40% of the people aboard these ships have decided to desert before the end of that 3.5, 4-year voyage. So what happens was the people who went over and over and over again happened to be people of color. They had no other opportunities. A young Black man, a young Cape Verdean, a Native American couldn't go next door and get a job, at his uncle's farm. He couldn't work in his dad's store. They didn't have these kinds of occupations. They didn't have these, economic things available to them, that white men, certainly had. So over the course of all of these years, while you're on a whale ship, you find yourself 1,200 miles from shore, something happened to the captain. He was killed, he was hurt, he was injured, he left, didn't matter, really what happened. But from 1,200 miles away, all you wanted to know if you were aboard that ship was who's going to get us home. Alternatively, who's going to help us get more whales and fill these barrels before we get, back home. And invariably, it was a man of color who was left and promoted along the way to what we have called replacement captains. Now, of those 15,913 trips, of those 2,700 trips, of those 2,500 captains, 950 of them were literally replaced aboard ship in the middle of a whaling expedition. And in many of those instances, we know at least 50 times a man of color was able to take that person's place. And that man would receive the same benefits as any other captain. He's doing the same work. He's providing the same, opportunities for, a bunch of employees, aboard that ship. Let me pivot just a second because, I am going to talk about Long Island, a little bit, but there were 75 total whaling ports in America, all except Hawaii and San Francisco, pretty much in the East Coast. All of them were north of, say, Delaware. There were no trips taken, whale trips, anywhere in the South. More importantly, few whale ships even stopped at ports in the South, thanks to, back in the old days, in 1793 and 1850, America adopted what were called Fugitive Slave Acts. That meant if someone who owned slaves thought you may be one of theirs, they could take you back into slavery. So you can understand why a whale ship, a ship which may have 35 to 40% of its entire crew aboard were people of color, you weren't going to stop in a southern port and have your people taken off and put into jail or taken, into slavery. That wasn't a good business. Most of these whaling trips, most of these ports really broke down to a rough kind of a triangle between the island of Nantucket and Martha's Vineyard, the city and port of New Bedford, and Sag Harbor out in Long Island, where you guys are. Oh, I probably, need to remember to thank a couple of people. Certainly Gianna Volpe from WLIW for hopefully telling you people about this and interviewing me last week. And Brian Boyhan of the Southampton Press wrote a fabulous article, about the book. So hats off, I thank you. I do appreciate that. But getting back to these areas of these ports, I think you could probably say those ports accounted for about 90% of all whaling dollars, of those years. Yes, there were several other ports. San Francisco cannot be ignored because, once whales moved on and migrated to places where, whale killers were not, and whale oil was no longer used to heat our homes, to light our streets. Then we use the parts of the whale called the baleen, the material that is kind of like our fingernails. It hangs from top of their mouths as they swim. They're using it to separate the water and seaweed from the krill that they eat. Well, we would use that product called baleen in many of our products over the years. You could use it for brushes. The most popular use for it, of course, were those busts that women wore to make them have those 18 inches. In fact, it is said, the whales had a huge party, when late in the game, the French decided that was no longer the fashionable look. Women did not want to have that, and there was no longer a use for baleen, and the whales were saved. So one of the questions I was asked is, how were these men selected to be replacements, on these trips? Well, there's no clear-cut answer to that. In some ports where we had established relationships already, it might be a customs officer could be say, okay, sometime the captain, dude, you're the next one, you're up, you're in charge of the ship. It could have been just consensus by the crew itself, which leads to, another answer to a question, someone's going to ask, well, what about racism? If this business took place in the years of slavery, how did people feel about these men? Well, if you go back, you'll recall, each trip lasted 3 to 4 years. The longest trip aboard the Nile, I forget what year, I believe it was 1858, was actually 11 years and 6 months. So imagine being in working conditions that are not too fun to begin with 25 to 36 men for that long a period of time in a relatively small vessel. By that, the Charles W. Morgan is the last whale ship that's afloat today. To describe it in more useful terms, if you took its cubic foot area, it's roughly the size of 2.5 American homes. So how would you like to be in the space of 2.5, average size American homes for 3.5 to 4 years? Now that's a very important and pertinent part of the argument, because you couldn't fight aboard ship. You had to get along on a whale ship. A whale ship, the captain, its master, was virtually omniscient. So a captain could say, you do this, and your job was specifically do that, get out of the way until you're told, what to do next. The reason for that is most of the people who found work in this occupation, these weren't graduate students. These are people who fundamentally needed a job. These are people willing to work in awful conditions, very poor pay, terrible food. The business was so bad that, and I've asked, I'm sorry to digress, but what's some of the worst things about whaling? Well, there are two I found. One, on many ships, they had a communal barrel that they used to urinate in, and they used the urine to clean their decks and to clean their clothes. The rationale behind that was the ammonia in urine, of course, cuts through grease and cleans a little bit better. But how dirty did your clothes have to be? How bad did that ship have to smell if that was your alternative in cleaning it? That's one story. Another one, which I think was the worst, I was just horrified by it. But the space you're allotted on a whale ship, your personal space at 3.5 or 4 years, is roughly the size of the back seat of your SUV. Give that some thought. Spend the majority of your time, your 8 hours a day sleeping, your 2.5 other hours when you're not working, in the back seat of your car for 3.5 to 4 or more years. There was one man, there was a story. I guess the temperature was probably 170, 120 degrees, just very, very hot. He's in his bunk. It's pitch black at night. He didn't mind being covered with bed bugs. Being covered with roaches, because they ate the bed bugs. And of course, the difference is the bed bugs bite you and the roaches, did not. Who among us wants to be comfortable with having your body covered with roaches the entire time, while you're sleeping? But that's a pretty good way of describing how bad things were. And if things were that bad, these are the people who would pursue that occupation trip after trip, year after year, year after year. I've got two of my captains on one, John T. Gonzalez, who was the last master of the Charles W. Morgan. I believe he took 32 whale trips. Another one, William Shorey, one of the masters from San Francisco, I believe he took 24 or 28 some whale trips. Now, again, 90% of the 175,000 people who put their feet aboard a whale ship only did that once. That's how bad it was. So that also kind of points out the differences between if you were a marginalized person in America in those years versus being the young white person, the 16-year-old blonde-haired, blue-eyed, who, by the way, is represented in a whale ship with a harpoon in a statue in front of the New Bedford Free Public Library. And everyone who knows anything about whaling knows, out of all things, that was not what that guy was doing. Almost exclusively, that man was Black, Native American, Cape Verdean, who was the first to throw that harpoon over the years. Anyway, these men of color were able to rise to become captains. Yes, some were able to put the finances together to buy a second ship. Some were able to have their sons join them and become a captain themselves. Very few times that happened. As I recall off the top of my head, I think only about 6 of those. Because the reason we don't see the big, huge white houses overlooking the fabulous harbors of Nantucket, New Bedford, and here in Martha's Vineyard, where I live, is because you couldn't go to a bank if you were Black and come up with the rest of that mortgage. You didn't have quite that amount of money, to buy those big houses. And if you did, the neighbors might not let you live there. Such was the nature of the working conditions and the times that whaling had its heyday, if you will. There was no such thing as an occupation for men of color in those years to rise to whatever occasions, there were. And of course, the money that they made, my ballpark guess is these men probably generated about $75 million. Since they were captains, that probably is a $7 to $8 million that they were able to share between them. Now we're talking about from 1700 till 1928. So there's not a pure mathematical formula that you can use to define that. But if you use that as a composite, you can see what these men generated. And of course, that's part of why they did it. I've also been asked, how did I find these people? In all candor, I knew nothing about whaling. I'd never heard of a Black whaling captain. And so the Charles W. Morgan was refloated several years ago, by the Mystic Seaport. One of its stops when it went back on the water for its final whaling trip, was here in the Martha's Vineyard. And I was one of those fortunate enough to be able to get on that ship and see what it was like. I'll tell you, I never want to be on a whale ship again. I couldn't stand erect. I'm not a tall person. I couldn't stand erect in the forecastle where these men spent the majority of their time. That boat, the Charles Lloyd Morgan, had huge significance here on Martha's Vineyard. It was built in Bath, Maine, but it's 7 of its many captains were from here in Martha's Vineyard. Most of its crews were from here, on this island. So that was a big deal. Enough so that the editor of Martha's Vineyard magazine, where I worked, asked me if I'd write an article about William A. Martin, the black whaling captain. So I was delighted to, be a former broadcaster, but now I decided I want to be a writer. I can write for a magazine, and in the magazine, my hometown, my home island of Martha's Vineyard. It didn't take me long to ask myself the same question you might. How in the hell does someone black get to be a whaling captain in the 1800s? And then, of course, I found out that William A. Martin was not anywhere near being the first, nor was he the only one. And I found the rest of these men. Well, from that curiosity, I went crazy. I'm widely acknowledged to be ADHD, and OCD. You can see on those 3 shelves on the bottom over there, in those the first 2 or 3 collections over there. Those are whaling boats. So in order to find out how this guy got to be a captain, I went out and started buying whaling books and reading them and making notes. Thanks to the ADHD and my being not the most mature person on the planet, my wife actually pays all of our bills. I've got an ATM card and I have a small allowance. Well, about a month later, I was way, way over my allowance. And Karen came into my office and says, "What the hell's going on with all these Amazon purchases?" I said, "Oh, I found this guy named William A. Martin. I'm writing a book about him. He was a whaling captain." And she's like, "What? Let's get back to, you spent over $1,400 on books." Well, and well over $4,000, in books at this point, because that curiosity didn't stop. I kept buying them and reading them and making notes. So I made all these notes about whaling on this huge spreadsheet, actually 1,400 different lines of, what book was it, what page was it on, and here's the subject. So I can immediately go there and say, well, how fast did whales swim? And I can find that answer because I had to include them in the book. Well, along with all those books that, I read, bought, and took notes from, I also read, 200 or some monographs, which is the equivalent of a master's thesis, if you're going to graduate school about whaling. I have no idea how many websites, Google was a friend, so I went and read all those things. By the time I actually got around to publishing the book, the day I sent my first manuscript to my publisher, the Naval Institute Press, in that email, I said to the editor, "How long should this book be?" And she says, "Oh, I don't know, 75 or 80,000 words. As soon as she opened that email, she found I sent her a 160,000 word document with over 1,500 footnotes about these 50 black whaling captains. Her response was, "You're not writing the damn Bible. It's a book about 50 guys. Cut that down in half." So I was able to do that. And then she said, "And by the way, we don't use Wikipedia and we don't use Ancestry.com as a source. You cannot use those. You need other principal sources." So that was very helpful in reducing the volume to, substantially. I think now we're somewhere between 80,000, 90,000 words. If you haven't bought the book, and by the way, if you haven't yet, please go out and buy 6 or 7. You're going to have, friends who are going to have anniversaries and birthdays you can share them with. I also wound up meeting 6 descendants of whalers, whaling captains, one of whom, by the way, is probably the last living descendant of an actual whale captain. Her dad died in 1989. His first whaling voyage was in the early 1900s. I actually have an old sepia tone black and white video of him on a DVD describing what it was like to be a whaler, working for his dad on his first whaling trip. On his first whaling trip, 5 boats, went out to catch whales together. Only 3 of them came back. 2 of them sunk in the storm that he was in along the way. Again, reaffirming, how bad this business was. I've spoken to experts in the Cape Verdean community, the Cape Verdean educational, community, if you will. I mentioned some of the museums, that I went to and studied at. New Bedford Whaling Museum and Library, Nantucket Historical Association. and the New Bedford Historical Society, the New Bedford Public Library, the Martha's Vineyard Museum, the Provincetown Public Library and Whaling Museum, the New York Public Library and the Schoenberg exhibit. And then, of course, the experts. I've been so very fortunate. Mark Prochnick, who's the librarian of the New Bedford Whaling Museum, saw me there. Oh, I've been there 3 or 4 times, taking notes. And he says, hey, what are you doing? I've seen you here a couple of times. I said, well, I'm writing a book about black whaling captains. It's, oh, wow, you're in the right place. We've got them. There must be 12 of those. I said, matter of fact, I've got 40 so far. We developed a wonderful relationship. And Mark was able to locate for me things I didn't know existed. One extraordinarily important one is when some of these captains died, they would leave a scrapbook about, their dad or their husbands or whomever's life it was. And these would donate over the years to the museum. So when I was able to come up with these names, Mark would show me these scrapbooks, and I was able to find stories and newspaper articles and clippings to include in the book, because what I was trying to do was to give him a composite, if you will, of what it was like to be a whaler and a black whaling captain in these years. And my starting point was zero. I had absolutely no idea. Despite the fact that I've lived on an island, I live in a town that was founded all at once by whale money at the end of its days, at the end of its business. Some people like to single out, as I turn now towards Long Island, Professor Nancy Shoemaker wrote the book, Native American Whalemen and the World. I had discovered the Lee brothers from out in the Hamptons, Sag Harbor. The Lee family, if you will, the patriarch was a runaway slave. The mom was a Shinnecock Indian. The sons, there were 5 sons. 2 of them wound up becoming whaling captains, William Garrison Lee and Ferdinand Lee. As it turns out, I found myself friends with Ferdinand Lee, the great-great-grandson whose wife I worked with in one of the businesses I operated several years ago. So I was able to talk to him about, what was this like? And he had almost no knowledge of this because, as it turned out, whaling was not a transferable skill. I think the key ingredient for whaling is not having an alternative, followed closely behind, by maybe I'll get rich. And for these men, it was clearly a lack of an alternative. There's nothing fun about this. And you can see that, in my list of whalers, what I've done is I've cataloged these men by the year they became a whaling captain. When you get to the mid-1800s, after the Civil War, the specifically Black people, were gone, which is something I neglected to share with you. There were no African Americans from 1619, when, according to the New York Times fabulous article, 388,000 Black people like me were brought from Africa to here. The next thing you'll realize, my dad, who did a lot of work over in the African continent, said to me one time, there's no one Black in Africa. They're all Africans. So the construct of Black is a descriptive one that we use in this country. But from the time the country was founded, from the time the country was discovered, until 1865, we weren't Americans and we were no longer Africans. We were just Black. And frankly, because of slavery and the latitude slave masters were allowed to take, we're hardly Black anymore. Now we're people of color, we all different variations of less than Black. We can call it brown, as an example. So I had to parse, how did people self-identify? Paul Cuffey, as an example, here is a man who believed himself to be Black, even though obviously he was half Native American. The Lee brothers, obviously half Black, they considered themselves to be Native Americans and acted on that. Well, it's thanks to Dr. Shoemaker, who I called, I emailed her actually one day and said, listen, I'm looking for your piece, called Mr. Tashtego, which is about the Lee brothers and Native Americans, who whaled on Long Island. She says, oh, and we talked for a while. She said, well, look I'll send you some stuff. Dr. Shoemaker read 2,100 whaling logs. easily the most boring reading you can ever imagine. And when I say that, I've read tens of logs, not hundreds. I've read tens of logs. I'd rather read a phone book. I'd rather read a matchbook cover. They're hard to read. There's very little useful information. They're difficult to see. The cursive is dramatically different than we use today. The terminology is so everything about it was difficult. In her reading of those 2,100 logs, in order to identify all of the Native Americans who went whaling, she also listed the men of color. Okay, she sent that information to me via email, and I had to actually go out and buy a software program called FilePro to access the data she sent me, which turned out to be about 345 pages of her research, from which, after seeing that a man who I determined was Black had been a captain, I could see all the other ships that he had worked on. And I could tell the story of his life so I could share with you that composite of what it must have looked like to be a Black person or a person of color, particularly in these years, going whaling. In the doing, going back to those 388,000 people, a lot of us forget. Around June 16th, Juneteenth, or however you describe the end of the Civil War, when Black people were freed from slavery, we freed 3.9 million people. Or it's another way of saying, we went to another country. We picked 388,000 seeds. We grew them to do our work, our bidding for our consumption. And then finally we released them. That's a huge number. And I'm gratified I'm able to kind of tell this story because there's so many stories of what happened from those 388,000 people to those 3.9 million people today. What else did they do besides being whaling captains? Okay, where are the other, hidden figures, if you will? Like the time after seeing the movie like you did, I was astounded on the way home. I'm like, oh, wow, this is crazy. John Glenn said, I'm not getting on that spaceship unless that Black lady does the math first. It took me about another 2 seconds to realize, hey, wait a minute. This isn't slavery. This isn't ancient times. I was alive when that happened. I probably watched that on TV. Why do I not know this story? So here's another story that hasn't been told. I'm telling it about these 52 men who become whaling captains, or proving that if you're good enough to do the job, you can. Hence the nature of the title, Whaling Captains of Color, America's First Meritocracy. Teasingly, I often say the next time there's a meritocracy, we call it the NBA. But we still have a long way to go. But think what these men were able to do in those times. I'm probably going to, start rambling, so Connor, why don't I suggest if there are any questions, why don't we start speaking about some of those, see if I can answer.
Yeah, that sounds like a good idea. So yeah, if anybody has any questions, please feel free to submit them in the chat bar or in the Q&A function here on Zoom. And I'll start asking them to Skip. And I'll say just first that this has been a great talk. I've definitely enjoyed listening to you talk about everything. I maybe, as somebody who does a lot of research on the whaling industry, is kind of like my main thing, working at a museum that's a former whaling captain's home. It's sort of a big topic that comes up a lot. And this topic of talking about people of color's interaction in whaling in different ways, and specifically as captains, is something that I've just not had the ability to learn too much about. And so
yours is, by the way, a beautiful museum. I've been there.
Thank you.
Several times.
But yeah, so now having this book as a resource is really a fantastic way to learn a lot more about these, as you said, hidden figures. And so I'll start with a question that was actually emailed to me the other day by a Noel Hankin. I don't know if Noel, if you're here in the chat today.
Oh, Noel Hankin. Hi.
But he sent me these questions the other day, so I just want to make sure to get him in. And he said, were any of the Black whaling captains landowners?
Yes. It's so bizarre. Paul Cuffey was more than a man. He was more of an entity. He died owning 170 acres, I believe, just south of New Bedford in Westport. He's about the only one that, that owned land. Most of these folks didn't spend a lot of time on land to begin with. Paul Cuffey was a little bit different. He would go out and catch whales. He would bring them back to the closest port. He would sell the oil, but then he might pick up a load of gypsum and take that somewhere else. Because he saw the value of owning a fleet of ships and putting men to work on them.
Gotcha.
That's how he made his money. Paul Cuffey was the equivalent of the first Black millionaire over the course of his life.
So he said, in relation to that question, if you know of any that owned any houses on Main Street in Sag Harbor, or maybe in the Sag Harbor area.
I do not. To my knowledge, the William T. Shorey House in Oakland, California, I think is a national landmark. He was there. Captain William A. Martin here in Martha's Vineyard. His home still stands, although it's in disrepair, on the island of Chappaquiddick across the harbor from Edgartown in Martha's Vineyard. There's another half dozen. We know they had homes. We don't know what has happened to them. They're probably not on the National Historic Register of Historic Places, as well they should. But this was a subsistence business. You made the money, you came back, you fed your family, you did what you needed to do, but the money didn't last that long. You were not in a position to invest it and grow it like everyone else was.
Yeah. And then his last question was also, were all Black seamen considered free? Which I know is a kind of a complicated question.
It is a complicated question. Yeah. You could say yes with many differences. Remember, on a whale ship, you're there for 3.5 or 4 years. So you're going to get along. I do have a section there, and I talk about, use of the N-word. Okay, using that word on a whale ship could get you killed, and with no recourse for the killer, if you follow. But if you're on a naval vessel, or if you're on a merchant marine, and you're going from point to point, and you're not going to be there for 3.5 or 4 years, you could get away with being, the worst racist the world has ever seen. Although I think he died yesterday. Editorial comment couldn't resist.
Yeah. So let's see. So we had a bunch more questions fall in as we were talking, which is great. So first one I have here is, can you talk a bit about whaling wives? Did they really join their husbands on board? This person also said, thank you for this interesting talk. And they actually got married at Martha's Vineyard 30 years ago.
All right, nice. Come back for the reunion, for the anniversary. In a direct comment, yes, women and sometimes families went aboard whale ships. You can imagine this is not the place for a woman. This is not the place for children. But there's several things. One, I referred to Lisa Norling's book, Captain Ahab Had a Wife, which is a very good, I met Lisa, very, very good book, and it talked about some of these women, excuse me. To our knowledge, only one woman has actually gone whaling as a whaler who pretended to be a man and stowed away aboard a whale ship. Soon she was caught and taken off of the ship. One of my captains, Valentine Rosa, was aboard a whale ship. He's a Cape Verdean, and the wife of the captain was aboard ship and was a navigator and taught him navigation. His wife, Valentine Rosa's wife, also learned navigation. She was on the boat with him and their family, as a matter of fact, when he wrecked the Cannon 2, that he wrecked on a reef, but he was able to save his crew and his family's life. So yes, several of the men did take their wives, on ship. William T. Shorey did. I think he left his wife in Hawaii for a period of time so she could have another one of the babies. So yes, there were some, not as many as you would think. At the Martha's Vineyard Museum, there's a very, very, on their website, interesting story called Girl in a Whale Ship. And it's about an 8-year-old little girl who with her parents was on a whaling ship and took notes and talks about it. Now this isn't literature, this is an 8-year-old little girl. But it gives you a fabulous peek into the past and what it must have been like in those times.
Yeah, we've done a few different small exhibits or things like that about the women's involvement with whaling. And I've read a few of the whaling logs we have and letters and things like that from women that were on ships. And They're mostly just like, I get the feeling of, why did I agree to do this?
I think that everyone who's ever been whaling,
Yeah.
It takes maybe 2 buoys. That's my guess.
Yeah.
2 buoys offshore. I want to get the hell off this ship. Don't ever want to do it again.
So we have another question here. They said, thanks for the wonderful talk. Just ordered the book on Amazon, and I'm looking
Yes.
forward to reading when it arrives.
Thank you.
And they have 2 questions. Did any of these whalers work aboard ships with Chinese immigrants? And were any of the whalers also expected to cook on board the ships before they became captains? Thanks again for the great talk.
Good question. Yes to both. Let me see. There weren't as many Eastern people on whale ships in those years that you would suspect. The Chinese, I know, were involved in our railroads. Our railroads didn't come until the end of whaling. In fact, it was whaling proceeds that were used, to invest into the Industrial Revolution, if you will. But of course, yes, there were some. I forget the exact names, you'll forgive me, but I believe it was a man named Dwyer who was aboard a whale ship, and they were fishing off the coast of Japan, where we were not allowed to be, but he did save some Japanese fishermen and get them back. And of course, they were thanked and said, don't ever come back here again. So yes, there are some of that, not as much as we'd like to believe. The other thing, there's so much information we don't have. Whaling peaked in the 1840s, 1850s. We didn't discover photography. There weren't cameras until the 1840s, so we don't have that many pictures. These people didn't have, amazing educational backgrounds, so we don't have their stories. They didn't write these things down. They were too busy whaling. So the information we have is less than thorough. It's surprisingly more than many other industries, however, thanks to the Seamen's Protection Certificates and what we today call the crew list. By the way, Google Mystic, and you'll they've got a fabulous exhibit online. You can type in your relative's name if you want to find out if they were a whale or not, and get the answer. But
That's
the
fantastic.
Mystic community and the New Bedford Whaling Museum have put this together.
Yeah, they've been a big help to myself too in doing research. Yeah, the New Bedford Whaling Museum specifically has a lot of great online resources I think everybody should check out.
It's the jewel box for whaling.
Yeah, you were talking about the Mercator Cooper who picked up those Japanese sailors.
Yes.
They have his entire whaling log from that journey is digitized.
Right.
I've read the majority of it, and like you said in your talk, it's very boring.
Yep. It's incredible.
But when you find that little nugget of important information, it's golden. So yeah. So we have somebody here saying that I'll paraphrase a little bit, but they're saying that captains that would take 20 or 30 trips, all their trips wouldn't be maybe 2 or 3 years each, right? Some would maybe be a few months and some would be years, right? Because the math gets a little crazy if you do 30 trips and they're all 3 years.
Yeah, no. Very, very few people took that many trips, first of all. Second of all, as the period of whaling, as you get close to the end of whaling, trips did not take as long. Okay, when you get into the late 1800s, a trip might only be 3 months. Colin Stevenson was one of the captains. I think he did 14 or 15 whale trips. None of them lasted longer than 4 months. Now you go back to the early days in Nantucket when Peter Green was aboard a ship, and it took 4 or 5 years before he returned home again. Typically, you wouldn't do that but so many times.
Let's see. So was this choice of industry to escape enslavement? It seems like an untenable choice.
Judgment call. In everything I've read, which is quite a bit of stuff, almost all whalers who are not Black say, "Oh, whaling is worse than slavery." Easy for you to say if you haven't been a slave. But if you want to put that in context, you were one of those 388,000 seeds that were stolen from Africa, as Bob Marley says. And you were brought here with your family. Well, your son could be taken and sold, your daughter could be taken, and who knows what happens. Your wife could be taken, just as sheer enjoyment for the slave master. It never happened in whaling. So, no. Whaling was certainly bad, but nothing was as bad as being owned as if you were a rock by other people. Now, and there are probably another dozen or more captains who were men of color who we don't know if they were black or not, because over the years, white slave master impregnates a black slave, and they have a child who's darker than one and lighter than the other one. 3 or 4 generations down the road, which is when whaling took place, someone could be very fair skinned, light hair, light eyes, and you may not know that they were black. Now, this all stems really from Frederick Douglass, who, using the Seamen's Protection Papers he was given by a friend, was able to, using that other man's name and papers, to escape from Maryland, where he was a slave, to go to New Bedford and work on whale ships as a caulker. So yes, it would have been a good avenue to get away from slavery, but we didn't have books and newspapers and magazines and radio back in those days. And if you were black and you were a slave, you weren't allowed to be taught to read. So we didn't know that this different occupation was available.
And I'll say a little bit sort of similar to what you're talking about too, is a question, I don't know if somebody asked it yet, but I get asked sometimes is, how did you know that maybe a captain or somebody on the boat was black or Native American or things like that? And they had those ship manifests, which now, when I would think about it, it would be crazy to ask these types of questions, but it's really a great useful tool to have a section.
It'd be illegal. It's illegal to ask those questions today.
Yeah, like a section for complexion, hair type, not even just color, but hair type.
Hair type. And had we not had this information, I couldn't have done this book. We would know nothing about this.
Yeah.
In all candor, I happened upon this accidentally. I'm not an academician. I certainly don't belong in school, and I proved that over and over and over again by not attending. But there's really no reason to suspect that there were black whaling captains. Okay, the whaling community has been astounded. I've been able to discover, this many of them, and it's a whole new, area of study we can pursue. I've got about a half dozen, 10 or so people in the book that I list, and I can't prove if they were black or a person of color, or I can't prove they were captain or either, but I suspect they were. And maybe someone can find a way of doing more research than I've been able to find to see if that's true. But no, whaling was not the first option for a runaway slave. The first option for a runaway slave was running away, getting as far north as possible and hopefully to Canada, as I understand it. But a whale ship would have accomplished that goal for you, but it wouldn't have been your first choice if you knew better.
Yeah.
Slaves were better fed than whalers.
So let's see. I like the wording of this question here. So were any of the cats of color considered cruel to their crew? A lot of alliteration.
Yes. William T. Shorey, one of my favorite, must have had a bad mood one day, but he pistol whipped one of his crew members, who turned him in. And he went ashore and he met with the constabulator or whatever. He brought him aboard ship and gave him drinks and cigars and, went away without anything happening to him. Another one, Henry Gonzalez, dude was a dead-up scoundrel, was a crook. He's one of my favorites, tall, good-looking Cape Verdean guy, smart in hell, competent. He took an exploratory expedition up to the furthermost reaches of Canada or something like that. Was hired as their captain, and he left them there and stole the boat. He was fooled into coming back, which is how he was caught. So yeah, some of these guys, were not wonderful people.
So I know you answered this question a little bit in the talk, but somebody asked, were any of the Native Americans from Long Island part of the industry?
Absolutely. The Lees are the one, most related to Long Island. They both whaled out of San Francisco, by the way. They both were whale ship captains independently. They both wound up dying on the same ship, the Amethyst, which never returned to port, up in the upper Northwest in the Pacific. But you also have Joseph Belaine, who was probably the last Native American captain here on Martha's Vineyard. You had one guy with a fabulous story, Amos Jeffers, who had been first mate of a ship and was named the captain on its next trip. And with a buddy went out off the coast of Martha's Vineyard on a sword fishing trip and never came back. So ironically, they think he was killed by a swordfish instead of a whale, which is crazy. And there were more. There's Amos Haskins. Altogether, I believe there are 7 Native American captains that we can clearly identify.
So someone here was also asking about Pierce Conser, saying that like with him and his trip with Mercator Cooper going to Japan, were there any other African American, maybe captains or things like that, that also went to Japan later on?
I have been trying to prove that Conser was a captain so many times. In fact, he captained merchant ships, but I've been unable to find any whale ships. And the problem was in the 1840s, Sag Harbor, had a huge fire and all of your records were lost.
Yeah.
So we are absolutely certain there were more Black, Native American admixtures, of these people who were captains, but unfortunately that history is lost.
But do you know of any other whalers who may have gone to Japan that were people of color over the years? Or, I mean, I would guess probably.
Yeah, the Japanese, I have to look in that map. The Japanese islands were not wonderful whaling grounds. They were really, really, really far away. You're not going to pass whales to go get more, right?
Yeah.
I say that the whole Asian hemisphere is something that happened later in the life of America and whaling.
Let's see. So we had a few questions. I'll combine into one, asking, and I think you answered this before, but were there any female captains of color that you talk about, or more so just like women that were on the ships?
Yeah, to my knowledge, there were no female captains.
Okay.
And I'm not making a value judgment. What I'm saying is, all of whaling took place in Victorian times. So the Moors and everything else were different, in those days. One thing I've often talked about, I've been encouraged sometimes when I speak with, middle schools, not to talk about, but there was no sex aboard a whale ship. People say, wait, what do you mean no sex? What about homosexuality was not a big deal. They didn't have prison sex on a whale ship when your space was the size of the backseat of that SUV. There was no privacy. There were fewer opportunities. I did find 11 situations. I didn't bother writing about it. Where there was an accusation, or an event that included something like that. It always had an unhappy ending. The person almost always dies.
Yeah,
so
I would imagine things like that.
3.5 or 4 years with no sex on top of everything else.
I'd imagine maybe things like that save for port cities and things like that along the way.
Yes.
And
that's how whalers developed that reputation.
Yep.
Local barbers had more of a reputation than an average whale captain.
So let's see, we have, can you talk more about how did whalers of color reconcile their success, excellence, and freedom with the sudden relinquishment of their freedom? And as you say, the whaling skills were not transferable, but what, in your view, did whalers keep as part of their experience?
That's a great question I don't know the answer to. I can only presume from what I've learned about whaling is if you can stop whaling for any reason, you probably would.
Yeah.
I can't think of, anything. In the early days of, Martha's Vineyard, Nantucket, before even New Bedford, when these men made their fortune, they were done with whaling, done with it. I have to presume the same thing to be true of everyone else.
During the longer trips where they would leave from Long Island or the Northeast in general and head out to the Pacific Ocean, what were some of the stops along the way, some of the port cities? I know San Francisco for sure, and probably Hawaii, but do you know of any others?
Yeah, San Francisco was only a big port because it was the only port in those days close enough to the Northwest Passage where the larger baleen whales were. Okay, so that you could do that. The only reason San Francisco was discovered by whalers in the first place was when they discovered gold in around 1850. And whalers in particular availed themselves of that. It's like, well, wait, would I rather be out on the ocean, with 20,000 different ways I can die and be uncomfortable, or would I rather go and dig gold where I can't even get hurt? So a lot of people did. A lot of whalers made a substantial amount of money with gold and stopped whaling as a result. one of which was Ichabod Norton here on Martha's Vineyard. I think he came back with about $5,000 and sent $3,000 worth of gold home.
Let's see. I think that was it we have for the Q&A. We have a few more in the chat, a lot more. I'll go through these really quick and see what we can see.
Nice.
Let's see, speaking of Moby Dick, even though you weren't, is there any veracity to the character of Queequeg?
As near as we can determine, you can probably take everything Herman Melville said as correct. The names, I'm sure, changed to protect the innocent. Herman Melville took a trip on a whaler himself on the Acushnet before he wrote that book. Herman Melville didn't know how big a book it was before he died. It certainly, was not a bestseller.
Let's see. Do you know of Hudson, New York, whaling town created from Nantucket Whaling Company? And they said that I read that there was another whaling group out of Poughkeepsie.
Yes, all up and down the Hudson River, they had ports. There were some of the 75 I included. I believe one of the Wayner's sons actually left and retired to one of those ports on the Hudson.
Was there any kind of like enjoyable part of whaling that you could imagine these guys participated in? Because I mean,
docking.
From research myself, it's a lot of doom and gloom. But,
docking and getting home, getting off that whale ship.
Yeah, most likely.
That's easy. Look, that's easy to say. Here are men with not modest means, but no means whatsoever. They didn't have. Shoot, they didn't have deodorant. They had nothing in their lives that was comforting and fulsome and wonderful. There were no comparisons. Everything was hard, back in those days, something we often forget. Today, frankly, if you think about it, when we think of whales, we think of Vineyard Vine's logo, that pink sperm whale. That's not whaling.
Yeah. In all your research, have you found any first source writings from these black sailors?
Most definitely. Yes. Literally, I've just finished a piece about William A. Martin, surprisingly, the first one. Our curator, our librarian at the Martha's Vineyard Museum, recently discovered 8 letters that William A. Martin had written to his owner, Samuel Osborne, back in Edgartown, from the port of Norfolk while he was on a whale trip. These letters were transcribed for me, and to my delight and surprise, I actually have the log of the trip he was on when he wrote these letters to his owner. So I've written a story about that for the Martha's Vineyard Quarterly. It'll be out the February issue a couple of months from now, I guess. So yes.
So let's see, we going back to the gold rush you were talking about before, were there any black seamen that jumped ship at that port to participate in the gold rush in lieu of whaling?
That's a very specific question I don't have an answer to. I have to presume it to be true because there were people fleeing whale ships at any and every opportunity.
Yeah, I know in the research I've done, there's been stories of whale crews in general doing this. So I would imagine plenty of those people who did that were people.
What's surprising is there weren't as many recorded mutinies as there were. I forget how many. I think it's about 15 mutinies. But the thing about mutiny is that was worldwide news, so it got an amazing amount of attention.
Yeah.
Newspapers would repeat stories in other newspapers, in those years. So those are pretty big deal, but there weren't as many as you would presume.
Yeah, and I know a little bit too from drawing back to Pierce Concert. He was also part of the Southampton gold mining company that was formed, which was formed out of majority of them were whalers or retired whalers that went out on an excursion.
Right, that's right.
So let's see.
It has always been said that Native Americans and men of color made the best harpooners.
Yeah.
Well, to put that in some perspective for you, in 280 years of whaling, the single technological improvement they had was called Temple's toggle. All right, Lewis Temple, an escaped slave, a blacksmith, invented this device. If you take a harpoon, which is a pointed spear, wooden spear, and you stick into the whale, it can come back out. Temple included a thing on there called the toggle, so when it was stuck into the whale, it would hold and remain attached to it. That was the only improvement in all of those years, because the tried and true way, apparently we discovered in 1605 when we saw the Native American community doing it, whaling hasn't really changed that much in all those years. For more than half the time whaling was a business, we knew nothing about whales. We didn't know that, they bore their young alive. We didn't know things we know today, like its heart only beats 8 or 10 times a minute, compared to a shrew whose heart beats maybe 1,000 times a minute and dies in a year. There was a harpoon carbon dated from a whale that had died. Come to find out, it was over 200 years old. So in theory, there are whales living today that may have lived since the American Revolution. Whales have a language. We know about that. We can't necessarily speak it, but we know they talk to each other. We know they have family units for life. We know they're possibly amongst the most intelligent creatures, on this planet. We believe they have a religion. And yet we sent out to kill all of these creatures, the largest creatures on the earth, including the dinosaurs, before we knew anything about them.
Yeah, it's definitely a weird topic that whenever I tell people, I know, as someone also like yourself, had no prior interest or knowledge about whaling until working at this museum. And now suddenly I can talk about it for hours on end without realizing. And it's sometimes a lot of friends of mine will bring up the ethical concerns of whaling. And I'm like, yeah, I understand.
Yeah.
Back then, a lot of things were weird ethically.
Yeah.
So it's a tough topic to get into sometimes.
But, in these terms, 175,000 men who participated in this, as many as 85% of them probably couldn't read.
Yeah.
What we're talking about. There was no media. There was no frame or reference for what they were doing at the time. It was kind of, day to day.
Yeah. It's a very different world.
Very, very different world.
And I'll say, when you're talking about Lewis Temple, we actually just posted on our blog. We have a Temple iron in our collection. And so we did like a little deep dive post about that, just not even really connecting it to this talk, just my coworker decided to do it. So we just posted it, I think, last week. So people can go and see a picture of it with a little bit of write-up talking about that versus other types of harpoons, if anyone's interested.
Interesting tidbit. And wait for another question.
Yeah, I'll say, I think with that, that is all the questions that we had. We have a lot of other people in the chat just saying, great talk, this is amazing, things like that. So I want to echo all the things they said. This is definitely one of the best talks we've done on Zoom since we've been having to do our programs like this. So I want to thank you again for coming. I want to thank everybody else for joining us today and listening. And yeah, do you have anything last to say before we go?
I do. You can get the book probably cheaper and quicker on Amazon, but please support your local bookstore.
Please do, everybody. Yeah, we have a great one. And in Southampton, you can probably get the book at. I think we're going to work on getting the book ourselves at the museum. You can buy it from us. And yeah, buy the book no matter what.
Yeah, and history doesn't count if you don't keep it. Support your Southampton Historical Museum with a check today.
Yeah, thanks for that, Skip. Thank you.
Thank you guys very much.
All right, have a good day, everybody.